Hey everybody, thanks for joining. So we're talking about Storybook, an interactive pattern library for your decoupled applications. And then there is this bit.ly link down here at the bottom, bit.ly/hot-jams. So that's going to lead you to a GitHub repository. This is a project that I've spoken about under other contexts, just about decoupled Drupal in general. So the Storybook is a music discovery app that we'll take a look at, but the repository has the source code for that, this Storybook, slides for this talk, all sorts of goodies. So if you're interested in more detail, it is there. And I am Brian Perry. I am a senior front-end developer at HS2 Solutions. I live out in the Chicago suburbs. I am a lover of all things component and component-based, which is a pretty popular opinion to be held these days. But things like building and theming with components in Drupal, using design systems and tools like Pattern Lab, and then increasingly building using a component-based approach in JavaScript frameworks like React. And then I'm also a lover of all things Nintendo. So if you want to talk about the cool games you're playing on your Switch, I'd be happy to talk. And also I am as on brand as possible today wearing my Zelda t-shirt. And I'm also on the internet in a variety of places and would love to internet with you. So as I mentioned, I work at a company called HS2 Solutions. We've got a couple of offices in the Chicago area. Drupal is one of a handful of things that we do, but I do work with a great Drupal team, learn a lot from them. We are, if you're looking to do great Drupal work, we're often hiring, and if you're looking to have great Drupal work done, I'm sure I can get you in touch with somebody. And thanks to HS2 for sending me out here. So we're going to look at Storybook, but being that this is this is Drupal GovCon, something that more people in the community may be familiar with is Pattern Lab, or using Pattern Lab in combination with your Drupal theming work. Who here is familiar with Pattern Lab? Okay, pretty good mix of people. So Pattern Lab is a tool that's also kind of based on the atomic design concept popularized by Brad Frost. So it's the whole idea of breaking things down into their smaller component parts, starting with something small like an atom, and then combining that into a more complicated molecule, and so on. And the general concept of building a design system rather than just a bunch of individual one-off pages. And if the atomic system is not quite your mental model for that, I feel like as long as you are taking that general approach of breaking things down, you are headed in the right direction. But so Pattern Lab is a tool that I know a lot of people are using along with their Drupal projects. And then as I've experimented more with component-based JavaScript frameworks, a question that I asked myself pretty early on is, how can I have some of that same workflow so I can have a dev tool to experiment with my components, see them in isolation, have something like a style guide that people can take a look at and play around with and understand how they're going to integrate into these things. So there are a bunch of different options for that. What we're going to focus on is Storybook. So Storybook describes itself as an interactive development environment for your UI components. And one of the things that is great about it is that it has a wide support for different frameworks. So we're going to talk from the perspective of React, but it works with Vue and Angular. So if you have, for example, at HS2, we work with a lot of the different JavaScript frameworks, so it's nice to know that if I get invested in this, we can share knowledge across the kind of different disciplines there. And then also it has a extensive set of add-ons, and we'll take a look at some of those and what they do. And it also has a lot of things it can do to help facilitate UI testing, even beyond just the advantages that you have for having your pattern library that has these components in isolation. So we'll start just by looking at a few examples of storybooks that are out in the wild. I think all of these were linked off on the Storybook site itself. The first site we're going to look at is Artsy, and we're going to look at it depending on how friendly the internet wants to be. But So Artsy is a like a art community focused site. They have like resources for artists, ways that people can make money off of their artwork. So there's a lot of works by artists you can look at. No internet. It's the one thing I should have checked. Yep. I thought I had everything. All right, cool. The internet is so great when you get it back. They also have, traditional articles in their magazine. Super slow. But here's a more traditional kind of article layout. Things like that. So they have their storybook available online. Preloaded this one, so this should be a little bit better. So here you have your different stories, in this case in the panel on the left-hand side. And so, for example, we can look at the artist selector under onboarding. This is the actual React component in this case rendered here, so it's fully interactive. So like if I search for Vincent van Gogh, I get results. I see what happens if I hover over these things, select Vincent van Gogh, etc. And then if we look under publishing, we see something that we looked when we briefly but slowly looked at the website. Under, let's see, articles, standard. Yes, this is an example of our standard article view that we were looking at. And then we see a bunch of different variations on the article view. And then down here at the bottom, this is an example of an add-on. So this is the scissors add-on. Kind of a weird name for what it does, but it lets you pick from common device widths. So I can see what this layout would look like on iPhone X and rotate it and all that good stuff. That's a nice little way to be able to experiment with how these components respond on different device widths. So then another quick example that we can look at is, this is for a library, Uber React Viz, that offers a bunch of graphing options. And I know that everybody always loves Uber in all contexts, so we can take a quick look at that. So they also have their Storybook available online. So this is just an example of a charting component that you might use. So here we see just a chart with example data, but then in the add-ons there's the knobs add-on, and we'll take a closer look at that later. But that lets you just expose different props on this component and make them configurable. So I can do things like turn off the x-axis, turn off the y-axis, get rid of the grid lines, and see what the sparsest version of this component is. But in general, just see experiment with the different variations that are possible with this component. And there's just another example of an add-on here is the JSX component, JSX add-on, which lets you see the JSX that would be used to render this. Certainly can be useful too, access some documentation. So those are a couple of quick examples. And now let's dig into how we would actually incorporate this into a project and write some stories. So as far as adding it to a project, we'll just look at the example here of adding it to a new project bootstrapped with Create React App. So if we're going to use Create React App to create a new project, we can run npx create React App and then provide our project name. And that's going to scaffold the project, create our project directory. And if we change into the app directory we created, we can then use npx to run get storybook with the Storybook CLI. That -p is where it lets you run a particular part of the package that is not its default name. That's why there needs to be this additional convention there. But this is in the Storybook documentation. But that adds Storybook to your project, installs the necessary dependencies, all that good stuff. And then after that, you can run npm run Storybook to run your Storybook and have that available, and hot reloading as changes are made to your components. Yeah, and it'll give you a local dev link where you can go look at everything. So now we can start looking into some of the code and some of the config for this. So one other common convention that Storybook doesn't do by default that I see a lot of people do that I think is useful is, so in this config.js file in the .storybook directory, this is just some configuration to get it to automatically discover your story files. So what I do and what I often see people do is they have a .stories.js file that lives next to the related component. And this kind of boilerplate here, we have like a little require statement that looks for all of the files that have that stories.js extension, and then it just iterates through them and loads the stories. I kind of wish it did this by default, but it's a few lines of code that's in the documentation that you can add if you want to take this approach. So next, we'll start with a small isolated component and kind of build up. And that's certainly one of the things that Storybook can do really well. So we'll take a deeper look at the app in a little bit, but this is based on a music discovery app. So one thing that we represent as a component is an album. So for the album here, we actually have a live rendering of it. We have a little album cover thumbnail, the artist name, a title, and then we see on the right the JSX that we could use to render that, all the props that we pass in, what you would expect, artist name, title, image, also some functions as well that handle some of the interactivity. So let's say we want to take this component and add a story for it in Storybook. This is what it would look like. So where the album component lives, we're going to create an album.stories.js file, and the React component itself is album.js. And then we're going to import React, because we wouldn't get too far without that. And then we're going to import stories of from the Storybook React package. Pretty much going to always do that as well. And then we're going to import the component that we want to base the story on, again, because we have to render it. And then the next thing that I'm importing is just another component from my source. It's really just to provide a little additional styling. I'll explain that when we get to it. And then next, what we're doing here is we're basically defining some mock data for this component. So we're providing representative data so that it can be shown and tested in isolation. So this is basically just an object with all of the props that this component needs. So it's really similar to the stuff that we saw just on the previous slide. Album ID, artist, path to an image, all that good stuff. So we just define that, and we're also exporting it. This is a pattern that we'll see in some of the examples that we look at. This just represents a default album, so if we export it, we can use it in some of our other stories or tests or things like that. We don't have to keep defining what a generic album is over and over. And then this is how we define the story. So we say stories of and provide the story type. So this is the album. And then we'll skip over decorator for just 1 second, but then when we say add, so that's adding the individual story. You can do one or multiple. We have the default state of this album component, and then there's a arrow function, and then just the JSX to render the album component. We'll see that we're using the example album object, and we're using ES6 object spread there, so that just takes the example album object and takes all those props and just explodes them out. So they just get passed into the component. It's just a nice, cleaner way to be able to write this, because otherwise you have all these add lines and a lot of indentation, and it's kind of annoying. And also, I think we'll see in a lot of cases, it's really convenient if you have example data that you use across these components that you just import in anyway. And then the next one, we have the active state. So what does this component look like when it's active? We still use the object spread for the example album object. But there's one thing that we want to override is if it's the active album. So we can just add that prop manually, say that it's true, and it'll override what came in the example album object. And then, going back to the decorator in this case is just a way to wrap this component, and the story, I guess, technically in this case. And the way the albums are typically displayed are in a ordered list in this app. So wrapping it in the album list component just gives it a little additional styling to make it look more like what it's going to look like in the actual app. So this is what it looks like in Storybook, and we can actually just go jump over there and see it. So it's the same exact component, just rendered in Storybook. I hover over it, and I see the hover state. We've got the default one, and then this is what it looks like when it's active. It just has a bit of a border around it. Great. So now let's start looking at some of the add-ons that we saw before and how we can incorporate those into a component like this. So in general, if you're going to use an add-on, you're going to install the dependency. So npm install savedev, and then the package. So we're going to start with the actions add-on. And actions is basically a way to mock functions that might be passed into, well, this is at least how I use it. There's a lot of things you can do with it, but I'm using it to mock functions that would be passed into this component that are not necessarily part of it. So we can at least track when those things get triggered and when the component gets interacted with. So in addition to installing the dependency, the other thing that you'll need to do is register the add-on in a addons.js file in that .storybook directory. So it's just an import statement. It'll be in the documentation. That's what it looks like. All right, so going back to our album component, this is how we would add the actions add-on. So we have our two import statements we had before, and then we're also importing action from Storybook add-on actions. Again, something you just kind of grab from the documentation for the most part. And then here we are also exporting a constant that represents our actions. In this case, it's really just showing the convention. It's probably not necessary because there's just one thing, but we'll create a object that has the select album action, and represents the select album prop that comes into this component. And then we just say action, and then in parentheses text for what we want to represent that action as. So it just, in this case, is select album, which is the same name as the prop. And then when we look back at where we're defining our stories, for the default, for example, I'm showing a couple of examples of how this could be done. So select album is the thing that we want to represent as an action. So if we were actually explicitly just going to define that in our JSX, we would just say select album for the select album prop, and then action select album like we see there. Or alternatively, we can just take the constant that we defined and also object spread that in, so that just gets added to props. And that just means when, in this case, somebody clicks on this to select the album, rather than trying to find that function that isn't there, it's going to use this action and basically just mock that event. So let's see what that looks like. So, this is just one album, so it's not going to give us a lot of useful information, but it certainly shows what it does. And if I click on it, we see in the action logger that I've selected album 0. It's the first key in the array. That gets more useful when we see examples where there's a handful of different albums, but I can click it a bunch of times, log my actions. So basic example of that, not super useful in this particular case in isolation. But let's keep looking at some add-ons. So the next one we'll look at is knobs, and that lets you make props configurable. So you can see how the component changes in different states. So here we're just adding an import for knobs. So you'll always import with knobs, and then there's a bunch of different knob types depending on what you're trying to make configurable. So there might be text, Boolean, integer, so on. So we just want text and Boolean in this case, so we're importing those. And then here you also need to use a decorator if you want to use knobs. So that basically you can just think of it as kind of wrapping this story in the things that knobs needs. Hit the microphone there. And then, so if we actually want to handle these knobs, we'll just, for the props that we want to override, so for example, I want to make the artist name something that you can change. So we just have the artist prop here, and then we just say text, because it's going to be a text field, and then the name of it, artist, and then a default value. Same thing for the title. And then for whether or not it's the active album, it's a Boolean. So similar convention, Boolean, and then we're setting the default to false. So let's see what that looks like. So we have our knobs here for this album, and I can change the artist name to whatever I want, and it's just going to update in real time. I always use War on Drugs as my replacement example because they had my favorite album of last year, but I can do things like put a really long title in here. See what happens, if I try to blow out the component, and then toggle on whether or not it's active. That gives you a nice way to kind of experiment and see what happens if there's data passed in this that we might not have been thinking about, what happens with certain combinations of props. It's pretty handy. So now we looked at just the small album component in isolation. Now let's look at trying to build up from there and create composite stories so that combine multiple components together. To do that and give that a little bit of context, we'll take a quick look at the app itself. So this is a Decoupled app. The data for this is there's somebody in Chicago that creates a really cool data set every year of all of the year-end best of lists. So they aggregate them all together in a Google spreadsheet. It's the best of list. And that seemed like a fun data set to play with. So I imported that into a Drupal instance and then built this React app to take advantage of that data. But we have a couple of different visualizations here. We have the cover view, and we see all of the albums that we were looking at before. But if we select an album, there's the detail panel on the right-hand side that shows the cover image, has a link to play the album on Spotify, and then links to all the different lists it shows up in addition to where it ranked on the list. And then we have this control panel here that lets us do things like restrict the number of results and filter by the artist, album, or genre. So again, if I want to go for my War on Drugs album, I see all the albums that have war in the title or artist. I can also sort here. And then all of the same filtering or sorting gets applied to all the different visualizations. So we have a table. And this table was really useful for me, especially as I was learning React, to basically just start with something really simple that kind of represents the data almost in the same way it was in the Google spreadsheet. And then from there, layer on some of this interactivity and then apply it to the other more complicated visualizations. And we also have a list view that is kind of like a little heat map. It just shows all of the lists and where in this case, the top 50 albums rank in the list, so we can see how commonly they're included on other lists. Kendrick Lamar is included in almost everyone, near the top. But then it gets pretty interesting if we pick a particular list. Rolling Stone is the most enjoyable one. So we see everything ordered by Rolling Stone, but then we can get a feel for how often the albums on the Rolling Stone list show up on the other lists. My favorite part is that the U2 album that they had as number 3 isn't included on any other best of list. So that's way to go, Rolling Stone. Yeah, so that's just a basic overview. So now let's look at incorporating these visualizations in our storybook. So we'll start with the cover view that we looked at that has the album component that we've been playing around with. And so a lot of this is going to start to look pretty similar based on the album example that we worked through, but we're importing the cover view component because that's what we want to represent in the story and that's what we want to render. And then next what we're doing here is importing some mock data. So for something like this that is going to show a number of rows of data, it's really helpful to define an example data set that we can reuse with these components. So this is just an object that has the top 10 albums that we can just import here and pass it into our component and use. And then we can use that on the other visualizations that we look at. So that prevents us from having to redefine that here or just use a small sample of data. But depending on what you're trying to represent, that can be a decent amount of work to get that example data set together, but it pays off really well. And then here, similar to what we did with the album, we're basically just defining a constant that represents the data for this visualization that's really just all the props. So we have the albums, and that's that 10 albums constant that we have there that we imported. And then the number of rows, and then what album is selected by default. And because this is something that can apply to the other visualization stories, we're going to export this so we can import it in there. And then, we have our actions that we defined before. And then, so we're saying it's a story of type cover view. And then for the default representation of this, we're just the object spread for the visualization data, the actions as well. It's just exploding out all the props like we saw. And then we have a few things defined as knobs as well. So we want to be able to adjust the number of rows and specify what album is selected. So aside from really having that data set up, there's not a whole lot new here to represent this component as a story. So we'll see what that looks like. We go to our cover view here and see the default view. And the cover view component was basically just the right-hand div there below the tabs. But we see what we would expect. We see 10 different albums here. And then there's the detail panel. And there are actions that get logged when we select the different albums. So we see that I've selected the fourth key in the album object. And then with things like knobs, I can change which album is being selected. So if I put 4 or 5 or even 45 here, I see the album in the detail panel that I would expect. Also, that was an example of, when you test with these things, you can see some states that maybe you didn't plan for and if things break. So I have 10 rows, but I put in 45. It handles that without, erroring out, so that's good. And, we can, change the number of rows, all the things you would expect. Okay, so that's the album view, and then let's just look at a few more of these visualizations. There's our list view. So all this, again, starts to look pretty similar. We're taking our visualization data that we defined in the previous story and importing that here so we can make use of it. Don't have to define any of that again. It probably should live in its own place rather than in the cover view story. But so now when we define the story, this list view just has a few different states that we want to take a look at. So we have our default state, and then we're making the rows configurable as a knob, and then we also want to be able to say whether or not the control panel is expanded. We saw when we looked at the app that there's a little panel on the left-hand side that slides out. This list view needs to be able to know when it slides out to be able to adjust its width. How to do that in order to get it to be reasonably responsive. So there's the default state there where the control panel is not expanded. There's what it looks like if the control panel is expanded. And then what it looks like if it just has one row. We'll see what that looks like. But so here, I mean, it's pretty much everything that we've done before. Because we defined our mock data and can reuse it, it's pretty easy to just plug that in and run with it. So here's what the list view looks like. So this is the default with 10 rows, and it's not expanded. If it's expanded, it looks like this. It shrinks down a little bit. And then seeing it with one row is interesting because it, is kind of big and ugly. And, maybe there's some, individual states that you really, really care about. And also all those things are configurable as knobs, so we can see how it responds when we expand or not expand it. And then, so the album table visualization with all that we've done before, there's really nothing special about this at all. We import the component, we import the visualization data that we defined, and then pass in our data, and then we just want the number of rows configurable, and that gives us album table, the table, and as you would expect, we can change the number of rows and see what happens if there's no rows, what happens if there's 5, so on and so forth. Okay, so yeah, now we have a good handful of these components in our storybook, and it's useful to be able to start with something small and build up, especially as you're developing these components. In going through that process, just a kind of last question I had is like, how far can we go with that concept? Can we actually have a story for the entire app? And it turns out the answer to that is yes. There's basically nothing that really needs to be in this story. So we just import the app, and then we render the app component, our top level component. So here's what that looks like. App. And in this case, it is actually rendering, it's actually going out and getting the data from our API and rendering the real component. Given the internet, it might take a little while. So I don't know that that's really what you would want to do here, but it was interesting to see that it was possible. But also if you did want to represent this whole app in your storybook, you'd have to have a lot of mock data, or if you're using something like Redux, you would have to create a Redux store for it. So potentially a decent amount of effort to represent the whole app here. So you got to ask if that's of value to you. But it's cool to be able to take the individual components and compare them to how the real app is actually going to render right here in the storybook. So it's the whole deal. We can do all the filtering and everything. Okay, doing pretty good on time. So let's talk a little bit about testing. So there's a handful of cool things you can do as far as using this to support testing. We'll look at a couple of them. One is StoryShots, and that it does just snapshot testing. And we'll look at some examples, but basically that represents the rendered markup for your component, takes a snapshot of that, and will fail a test if something changes. And then related to that, there's a StoryShots Puppeteer add-on that does visual regression testing. So rather than doing that snapshot, it actually takes a screenshot and compares the screenshots and does the overlay and diff there. And then the same data that you've created to support these stories can also be used in your unit tests to support those unit tests. So really having that good set of mock data is something, as I went through this, I learned is really useful and important. And then one other thing that I have not really dug into all that much, there's another add-on called specifications or specs. And that, I believe, lets you have, if you do have like unit tests or jest tests, to include them in your Storybook UI as well, so you can see if the tests for the component pass or fail. And then one other thing, if you are particularly interested in this beyond the examples that we looked at Decoupled Dev Days last weekend, folks from 4 Kitchens, I believe, did a Storybook talk, and they went a little bit deeper into some of the testing possibilities here. So if you're interested in this, I'd encourage you to check that out. So let's look at a test file here. So we just have in our source directory a storybook.test.js. Maybe you want one test file, maybe you want to break it up into multiple, but this is just a couple of simple examples. And in here, you would most likely probably pick one or the other, but I'm just showing the setup for both of those two types of tests that we talked about. So importing the dependencies, importing StoryShots, and then StoryShots Puppeteer. And then if we want to just create a default StoryShots test that's just going to crawl all of your components and take those snapshots, we can just say init StoryShots. And then something that I ran into that was good to know is possible is that you can instead initialize StoryShots and specify particular stories to be excluded. So there were a couple that I actually added the word demo to, so I had a nice regex to be able to exclude them. The one example is the app, so having the app included in this. When it tries to take the snapshot, it will not have gotten back data from the API yet, so it really doesn't work with this type of test. And then if instead we wanted to use the image StoryShots, there's just an additional configuration here. So the suite, in this case, we define it as image StoryShots, and then for the particular test that's run, we say an image snapshot there. So this is what the output is going to look like. First for the StoryShots. So it gives you a nice list of all of your components and whether or not they passed or failed. So if there is a change in the markup, for example, you'll see it as failed. And then here is an example of what that actual snapshot output looks like. It is just a text file that you can go take a look at, which potentially will be helpful in helping you understand why something may have failed. But it's good to look at this just to understand what this will and won't give you. It's very easy to set up, so I think it's really useful to have, but it's really just the rendered markup for your component. So if a prop changed or part of your markup didn't render for some reason, this is obviously going to catch that. But it's not going to catch necessarily something like the color of something changing or font size changing, unless there's a related class name or something in your markup. And then this is what the StoryShot Puppeteer output looks like. We have our initial state of the component represented as a screenshot, the current, and then, so in this case, I just changed the color of the text so that it's white or invisible looking, and it shows you a diff that has just the differences between those two screenshots. So that's very nice for coverage. And increasingly for Pattern Lab and Drupal projects, I use Backstop.js to do something similar. So it's nice to know that there's a way to do this in Storybook as well. And on deploying it, so you can just create a full static build of your Storybook and then post that wherever you want. So if you want to make it publicly available, you can do that. And there is a build Storybook command here that's in the documentation. You can run that explicitly, or you can have it be a npm script in your package JSON. And that is going to create a static bundle in the .out directory, and you can just take that and deploy it wherever you want. The Storybook that we were looking at is on GitHub Pages, so it's pretty easy to drop that wherever you want if you want it to be publicly available. And then to kind of wrap up, since this is still Drupal GovCon, I did want to tie this back into Drupal a little bit. And a question that I asked myself is, so it's good to know that I have Storybook, that is a tool that can do the sort of give us this interactive development environment and represent all of our components. And I also commonly use Pattern Lab, So, one thing I wonder about is, what happens if maybe we're using both of these things together in like a progressively decoupled app? Is there a way that we can make these things live together? Is it worth the effort? I definitely at this point do not yet have a clear answer on that, but Brad Frost has a project called the Style Guide, and it kind of came out of a blog post that he wrote a while back about the concept of the storefront and the workshop, I believe is what it was. And the basic idea being there is that he finds a need for there to be essentially a development environment for working with these components, which is really what Storybook and Pattern Lab is kind of intended to do. You can experiment, you can break things, you can prototype things that maybe aren't quite ready for prime time. But then there's also a need for a more formal, like these are the completed blessed components with deeper documentation. So maybe a cleaner representation of those patterns and components. So this project takes so for the React version of this, it takes your Storybook components and uses Gatsby to create a static version of the style guide. So it gives you your place to experiment and then the place to have your blessed documentation. There also is a version of that for Pattern Lab that you can use with the PHP version of Pattern Lab. So I wonder if it would be possible to stitch those things together. It's probably like a third layer of abstraction, but the question that I ask myself is, is it worth the effort? And is it fine to have these two things in separate places and separate tools? Right now, I think the answer to that for me is probably yes, but I'm curious if there does end up being a use case where it's important to have these together in one place. So, yeah, that's it. We do have a couple of minutes for questions. Ran long in my other session, so I wanted to make sure I didn't do that. I was bad, but better today. So yeah, hopefully that was interesting. But if anybody has questions, happy to take them. It is Friday. It's been a long haul, guys. All right, cool. Thanks. And yeah, if anybody wants to talk more or questions pop up, feel free to track me down. I'll be around today. Thanks.